So I am really excited to welcome back because I feel like Sky has now become a regular on our our events. We're really happy to always have her back. So Sky Perryman is the president. Oh, you got Megan up. We just need Sky. Just
Oh, sorry.
it's okay. Megan's probably like, wait, what's going on? Megan is with
Well, I
Democracy.
couldn't find Sky. That's what she was the first one, and I don't see her.
I'm now,
There you
I,
are.
yeah, okay.
All right, technical
There we go.
difficulties. First of all, everybody drop in the chat where you're from. Say hi if you're not already doing that. We'd love to know. And I know our Red, White, and Blue staff would like to meet you guys. All right. So Sky Perryman is the president and CEO of Democracy Forward. She was also a founding member of the litigation team for Democracy Forward. She most recently served as the chief legal officer and general counsel of the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. She oversaw their like a broad portfolio of legal and policy and public affairs work. But we're really glad that she's back at Democracy Forward because we really love working with them. So Democracy Forward is on the front lines of standing up for democracy and fighting back against all these extreme anti-democratic tactics that we're seeing out there, and extremists who are trying to roll back our rights. Democracy Forward is on the front line fighting that. They provide legal representation and expert counsel to people in these communities that are being threatened. They do it for free, and they've just been an amazing partner with us. So we, like I said, this is I think Sky's third time coming in here, so we are excited to have her back. Also, just as a little flag, she does a lot of legal work around the I'm going to say it wrong, mifepristone abortion pill fight it's going on. So I think we might even have her at the end do a short little blurb on what is going on with that latest court ruling on that, just to give you guys a twofer. We're going to get two different topics tonight. Okay, Scott, tell us a little bit more about yourself, about Democracy Forward, anything that I did not say properly. What do you want to tell us about you?
I'm a mom. I've got my team member, Meg Uzel, with me. She's a mom too. And I think, a lot of folks at Democracy Forward come to this work for lots of reasons, but many, we have a lot of parents that are concerned about their kids, and folks that aren't parents are concerned about their nieces and nephews and kids that they may have in the future. And so we really, in the Trump administration, which is when we were founded, we were singularly focused on attacking MAGA extremism at the federal level with what the Trump administration was doing, and did a lot of work that is relevant to many of the things you guys do with Red, White, and Blue, sort of across a range of federal issues. And our model worked because we work, alongside groups like you all. We bring innovative cases. Even in these hard times, we win a lot. And when we don't win, we use the law to really expose and force broader public accountability. So that's kind of our secret sauce. And so at the end of the Trump administration, when it was clear that the Supreme Court had changed, that Trump might be leaving Washington, but MAGA extremism had actually, more infiltrated even more than it had before, all over the many places throughout the country. We expanded our team, and that's what I've been doing for the last 2 years alongside Meg and others on our team. We expanded our team to be able to work with communities in many of the places that you guys are in. And I'll just say I grew up in Waco, Texas. I go back a lot. I have my mom and my mother-in-law are there. My godkids are in Texas, so I saw a lot of Texas folks in the chat. Meg will tell you a bit about herself, but she's from Kansas and keeps deep roots there. So, we approach this work and always have with sort of both a professional experience, but also a personal lived experience for the types of things that you all are living every day. And you are really our heroes. And we love this. We love coming to talk to you guys. And we're going to talk about education, a variety of stuff. And then I'm also happy to answer any questions about healthcare or any other issues. So
right now, we are obviously seeing a lot of right-wing, very extremist policies coming through our school boards across the country. I think it started with like an anti-mask movement, then we saw anti-CRT, and then it turned into attacks on, book banning, and then all of a sudden it's like sex ed and anti-SEL. And so can you kind of explain, like, these attacks just don't happen organically? Can you kind of explain how this comes about?
Glad you mentioned this about the mask and the public health work, and Meg, you should feel free to chime in too, because actually We knew and we know from history, this is not new, and many of you have lived this, that one of the places extremists go is to the schools. You had extremists trying to force, schools to continue to maintain separate but equal policies, even years after decisions like Brown versus Board. You've got folks that still won't say that they agree with Brown versus Board. I mean, we still have that. In fact, we have, I think, several justices on the Supreme Court that didn't even say that in their confirmation hearings. So the schools have always been a front line, and you all know that, those of you that are educators or parents in schools. And so we've been watching them a lot, and we watched them in Trump, and we could get into that, but that's not why we're here tonight. And then in the pandemic, sort of as the federal landscape was changing, but the state landscapes were becoming more extreme, we started seeing and you all have lived it, this anti-science behavior in schools. And Meg worked with others on our team and lawyers to represent the American Academy of Pediatrics and local pediatricians in briefs throughout the country in these cases where people were, becoming really energized around either anti-mask or anti-vaccine or anti-public health. And it was just bizarre. And so, what public records request showed at that time was that there were talking points going around, and that there were national organizations that you all face every day that were really trying to look like that there was organic movements in these communities to pummel public health, when that really wasn't the case. It was sort of led through a national piece. And then what we've done at Democracy Forward since then is follow those movements, which we see with respect to whether you want to call it curriculum transparency, book banning, whatever. I mean, it's all sort of part of a censorship agenda. And so what we have seen in our work every day, and we do work where we find out sort of who's behind it so that we know how to challenge these things in most effective ways, that really this anti-equity organizations that are national, they're a vocal minority. They don't represent the majority of people in the country. They don't even represent the majority of people in the communities that many of you live in, even in more conservative communities. But they're very loud and they're very organized, and they can sort of make you feel as if they're in the majority. And so that's what we've been looking at. And in Pennsylvania in particular, we're looking, we've seen the uses of tactics to sort of provide representation to school boards, trying to come in and say, we'll help you in the community, these right-wing groups, in order to really make it seem like there's a lot more support for this than there really is. And so we can talk about some of the fights. I mean, we won a big injunction in Arkansas recently against Sarah Huckabee Sanders' censorship agenda, and have done a lot of stuff there. But we are also really focused on who's behind this. And it's not just normal people in communities that are concerned about their kids. There's really kind of a fear-based national movement behind it.
Who are these groups? Like, who are funding these groups? And like, how are they getting this information to be placed in front of school boards?
So there's several groups. I mean, Moms for Liberty is one that's gotten some press most recently. Meg, you can remind me of some of the other some of the institutes that we've been seeing, but they're all funded through the same network. And by the way, these are the same networks that are funding anti-voter engagement. They're funding anti-reproductive health care. So all this stuff is related. And what they'll do is they go prey on people's fear and work in communities where there may be a bit of a perspective, so from some kind of far right folks, and equip those people with resources so that they really sometimes seem like they're the only ones talking. And when they seem like they're the only ones talking, people start believing that they are in the majority, or that there's a bigger problem in schools. There are problems in schools, but it's not the books aren't the problem in schools, and so that's what we've seen take hold in these communities. Meg, do you have other things you want to add to that?
I was just going to say, and I'm seeing a lot of the familiar names of the organizations being populated in the chat right now, and so not surprising, y'all are very on top of this. But Independence Law Center is one. I know everyone in Pennsylvania right now is really experiencing their influence. Vermilion Education, working behind the scenes with school districts, as again in Pennsylvania, I think there's been we've seen their influence trying to very quietly work with school districts, which I think is one of, says a lot. They're trying to do a lot very, very quietly, not being transparent about the contracts and their engagements and involvement, which leads to a lot of questions being raised. So again, I'm just scrolling through the chat and seeing a lot of very familiar names.
Yeah, a lot of the names, and that, you know, the Concerned Women of America, I mean, the Eagle Forum, they're similar. There's like an independent women. There's similar sort of groups popping up too that try to wrap themselves in this imagery of women and communities.
I think that's a valid point, whether it is like these anti-education groups or whatever. I know like with doctors groups, there's like the American Medical Association, and I'm losing track, but there's one that is, what is it?
Yes.
American Pediatrics, and then there's one that's like very
Yeah,
similar.
so the you know, there's the mainstream medical organizations like the AMA, the National Medical Association, American College of Physicians, ACOG, AMA. And then there have been sort of two efforts. One is to create organizations that seem like they're based in sort of a principled ideological difference. So something like the American Association of Pro-Life OBGYNs is one that's out there, APLOG. They do a lot of communication. But if you really look behind them, they don't, the majority of their members, I think, are not OBGYNs. They don't, I mean, there's a variety of things about them, and they take incredibly extreme positions. And in fact, we're opposite them in a case in Mississippi right now. But then there's other groups that are even kind of more misleading in some ways. So like in the pediatrician space, the American Academy of Pediatrics is the mainstream national medical group for pediatricians. The American College of Pediatricians, which sounds very normal, is this very far right group that puts out, you know, information that's not based in the most advanced science and evidence. And so it's very important to be vigilant with these groups. We saw that in COVID. We've seen in other places, to really make sure that you understand which groups are the real ones. And one thing I do is just, always Google the names, so that in addition to whatever the website you are on or whatever you're reading, you Google and you can kind of look and you see that, okay, this is the real group and this isn't. So that was really prevalent in COVID, and we see it post-ops too, with a lot of these groups popping up and producing misinformation.
Beside Googling, do you have any other advice on like where to search for some of these groups before, so you can inform people or push back a little bit?
Look, if you really want to get into it, you can go to Charity Navigator or some of the groups where you can see, I mean, they are online. And if they're a nonprofit, you can see their financial forms, and you can pretty much see really quickly. I mean, even though a lot of them try to hide who their donors are, you can see pretty quickly kind of what the size of the organization is and who's donating to it. But I do think, for medical groups, certainly the American Medical Association on women's health issues, the American College of OBGYNs, going to their sites, sometimes going to the original sites and looking and seeing, what they're saying and how that compares to something that somebody has sent you, is really important. And a lot of them are starting to do these things like facts are important bulletins or other things that you can read in order to make sense. So that's how, we do a lot of work. I think there are good, you should always go to our website and other sort of organizations that you guys are interacting with through Red, Wine, and Blue, because I think a lot of times you'll be able to see information about many of the issues that you all care about, and accurate information there. So that's another, I think, Julie, you guys do a really great service by introducing the community to groups that they can go and trust. So those are some, ways to be vigilant. But I do think, it's a lot easier now to do, even though there's a lot of misinformation, it is easier now to do research than it used to be. And so we all have to be vigilant.
Yeah, Southern Poverty Law Center is another great place to look up,
for the anti-hate. Yeah, I mean, the anti-hate, Southern Poverty Law Center. And what was the other report recently, Meg, that we were looking at? Wasn't SPLC, that we can send around some resources for sure.
Bridging Divides Initiative, I just talked to them. They do the very similar to the Southern Poverty Law Center, but
yeah,
cautious to the people in the audience. Like, there's a lot of groups that sound like they're very middle of the road, and they're not. So always be a little cautious. There's something that doesn't sit right with you, and kind of check it out. But let's go back to school board policies. So these policies are being created by these very well-funded right-wing extremist groups that are very anti-democratic. They have their own political agenda. How do these policies get in front of school boards who are actually voting on them? Like, how are they getting into the community? Like, you kind of mentioned that they that these people, these
Yeah,
organizations
these
will.
groups will actually, yeah, I mean, these groups will actually develop sort of model policies, and then they kind of push them out to some of their advocates that may put them on their own computers and sort of modify them in a little bit of a way, right? So that, one really great trick is if there's something being debated in your community, taking the language of whatever the bill or the measure is and actually doing some research around the language. What we found in a lot of our research is that many of these groups will use the same language. And so you could very quickly see, okay, well, this is what this bill is. And all of a sudden you're seeing news stories with that same language popping up about what's happening in communities. And sometimes you can get a little bit of more context for it. So, but yeah, that's what's happening is these national groups are sort of infiltrating local communities with model bills that can be very misleading, and the groups can appear very mainstream. Now, I want to say, like, it is an organizing tool to have model legislation. I mean, that's not something that's only reserved for these very far right groups, but I think it's important to know that right now, that is the strategy that they're using in the school boards. And so, I think looking at the language, checking it, we think, great resources like PEN America, the American Library Association. Meg, you're going to have to help me with some other ones. We have a lot of stuff, increasingly more things on our website at Democracy Forward, the ACLU. I mean, these are organizations that you can at least go and read about what the trends we're seeing are, so that if something comes into your community, you sort of know and have the background on it. What are the other, is there another resource that I missed? It's PEN America, ALA.
Those are some really good ones, Sky. The other one that I would throw out that I have found helpful is UCLA also has another resource, at least, to try to keep up on what books have been banned or censored in communities across the country, in addition to PEN America's great work.
Every library too.
Every library, National Book Foundation.
So you kind of touched on this, but so it can be that they've tapped somebody in the community to go in and present it to the school board. Is there evidence, or is it seem truthful that they are actually just going right to elected officials? I mean, there's a tie between elected officials even at the local level in these groups?
We've been doing record requests, and Meg, you should chime in because Meg's office is the one that's been filing them in various local communities throughout the country. And you do see that direct link sometimes, and then sometimes you see that it comes sort of through through sort of someone that writes them. But you can often see on those emails, the person that writes it or forwards it to them, where it came from below that. So yeah, I mean, it's an effort, and we shouldn't shy away from calling it what it is, which is it's a misinformation campaign, and it is a campaign to try to weaken our communities, weaken what we call the promise of democracy, because we know democracy has never fully fulfilled its promise of equity, but we've always been working towards it, at least in the last few decades. And this is really an effort to set all of that back, and to do that through preying on people's fears and sowing culture wars. And so that's what's happening in these communities.
So you mentioned records requests. So let's just say, for example, I went to a school board meeting and all of a sudden there's someone talking about a policy, or God forbid, one of my school board members is introducing a policy. What steps would you recommend somebody take in that situation to kind of figure out what the heck is going on here?
The first thing I would do is really try to read about, what the policy is, the keywords that they're using, and see if that comes in. I think that you all, through Red, Wine, and Blue, provide in your training boot camps. Is that what you call them? In your boot camps and stuff. I think yeah, I think you do provide, you provide lots of good information. We are always happy, and I say this, and we say this, and we love it when we hear from people. We are always happy if you email us at Democracy Forward, and Meg can put our emails in the chat. But we are always happy if when citizens reach out to us on questions, we will answer them, as will many of the groups like Every Library and PEN America. So I mean, don't shy away from reaching out to groups that you know to be trustworthy. Often, if they can't help you, they can find someone that will help you. And then I do think that some of these, sometimes they're very blatant, and the slides that they're presenting or the memo that they're presenting is branded in some way from one of these right-wing organizations. And so that's really about researching that organization.
Can you just explain? I think some people know, but some people may never have heard of the public records request, or what exactly are those? And is this like something you need to hire a lawyer for, or will people do this on their own?
Well, you can do it on your own. You can also hire a lawyer, and you can also talk if you have a good local journalist that you like to work with. Journalists know how to do public records requests really well, but most of the states, all the states that you live in and the federal government, there will be a law that sort of allows you to that creates transparency in certain records. Some states have really broad transparency laws and others have more narrow ones, but there's really not that much cost in asking. And so you can usually write a letter and, and you can sort of Google where, what state you're in and, how to do a records request, and you can write and request it. But if you are to come to a website like ours at Democracy Forward or get in touch with us, we do a lot of these and we represent folks for free, and they're pretty straightforward. And sometimes you get things back and sometimes you don't. And if a local elected official or government is withholding documents in most states, not in all, but in most states, you can actually sue to get the documents that you're requesting, and that has some good advocacy power too. And that's the kind of thing where maybe a group would help do that. But we've seen, and Meg and I built a case early in the Trump administration based on public records where we weren't getting, we sort of weren't getting what we needed. And so we filed a suit, and then that actually turned into another suit that ended up being a very substantive suit. So we can send you, Julie, we can send you we can send you some resources on how to do these and also sort of how to contact us. And Meg is doing a lot of this. Meg, you guys are doing, in our team at Democracy Forward, we're doing a lot of records requests on that for local communities. So truly, it's not a problem if you all want to reach out to us. We've got great folks on our team that could come and do a fun training. It really is like, if you can write a letter to the editor, or you can sort of write a letter to your kid's school, you can do a records request. But sometimes it's nice to partner with a group so that if they don't respond, you have a little bit of a muscle behind that.
Can you explain, just for people's understanding, if they're not really familiar with this, like what are the kind of things you can request, like from let's say a school board, let's say you're in a situation like we're talking about where there's just a policy being introduced, like what kind of things can you request and actually get access to?
So in most states, you should be able to request sort of correspondence is always a good thing. So any communication. So what that means in 2023 is emails and messages and correspondence. So you could say, all correspondence referencing the school board curricula, or you could say all correspondence with, this official or this group of officials concerning education transparency between this state and this state, right? You can be broad, you can be specific. You can, in many states, and certainly at the federal government, you can request calendars, like calendar entries or meetings. And that's where some of the juiciest information can come from. If you say sort of like, all records, including calendar request and meeting request or calendar entries. So you might be able to see that an official had a meeting or had a lunch with someone from one of these groups, a week before this thing arose at the school board meeting. And that would be a good, that would sort of be a good question to ask. So that's that, other things that you could request would be sort of all documents related to. Drafts are always great. If drafts are not reviewed by, if drafts are drafted by folks other than lawyers that are representing a client, sometimes you can see the draft legislation and you can see sort of how things changed. In another context, it wasn't in a school board context, but we got a trove of documents where these right-wing groups had come into communities to try to convince, city council people to pass ordinances to ban abortion. And what we found in doing that was that there was a lot of emails where even the very kind of more conservative, more right-wing leaning community members are like, I don't know if we should do this. This law sounds pretty draconian. It sounds pretty crazy, and so those are the kinds of things that are helpful because they can tell you, is there real support behind this, or is this just an outside group pushing this? in your community. So, but the good news for many of you, I mean, even in places like where I'm from, in Waco, where there's not, not a ton of organizations and stuff that can help you on the ground. But the good thing is that uh, journalists know how to do this really well, and they're interested in it. And so never discount sort of, if you want to be able to, it's like someone you trust or an outlet that you trust. You read a news story, you think it's informative, you think they're digging, they sort of take things from, a fair perspective. You can always reach out to the folks that are doing that, and you'll be surprised how much they'll want to work with you because they're trying to figure out what's going on too. So that's another resource in addition to groups like ours that do pro bono legal work.
You do a public records request, or you just see some stuff like this going on at school board and that it's, a right-wing group behind it that is, pushing this. Any advice on like how to best expose this to the community, to other people in your school district? Like kind of how to get the word out about this, whether it's, I guess it could be a lawsuit if but what are the other, any advice?
Lawsuits, like, first of all, lawsuits are a tool, and they're a tool for everyday folks. They're not a tool for just people in Washington. This is how we've had to fight these battles in the schools for many years. So don't be afraid to think about, like, is there a legal challenge here? Or even on something like a records request, maybe you don't know exactly what the legal challenge overall is, but you could at least challenge based on the records and tell a story. But there's a lot of ways that we see people are able to really make a difference in their community short of that. So some examples are, social media engagement, which I know that you guys do some training and things on. This is really important. There's a lot of folks in your communities that want their kids to be educated in a good way. They care, but their economic or working situation or their family situation makes it to where they're not going to be the one reading and researching every single thing at all times. But if going on and being the parent or the community member that is providing information, directing people to information that's accurate and that's helpful on your social media platforms or groups is incredibly important. And to Julie's point earlier, being able to call out misinformation, politely, but, this person posted this, just want to let everybody in the chat know, just want to let everybody know this group is supported this way. Depending on what the ideological nature of the platform you're on or the group you're in, you don't have to say, and therefore you should never listen. You don't have to take the next step, but educating folks is really important, and you can do that. Social media makes that harder because there's a lot more misinformation, but easier in those ways. Old-fashioned letters to the editor and opinion pieces are really important, even in 2023, where it seems like everybody's online. I can't tell you how many journalists will look at who is writing and what they're writing about in order for them to get their ideas for their stories or what to look into next. So that's really important too. And then developing relationships with community forums, with community journalists, with folks is really also another important thing. I don't know, Meg, if there are other things I'm missing, but I think those are some really good kind of exposure tactics.
Seeing on your point to social media, we've seen our good partners at the Florida Freedom to Read Project do exceptional things and trying to share information they've gotten through records requests by using their, just bringing some sunshine and daylight to the information that's available.
All these right-wing policies, extremist policies that are being developed by these obviously well-funded groups, do you think in your experience that this is really about like passing these horrible policies, or is this really just a bigger picture around public education? Like, what do you think the goal is behind all of this, if you can speak to that?
What our work and our research has shown is that the same groups that are behind these censorship, I'm going to call it, but whatever you want to call it, anti-CRT, anti-LGBTQ, anti-DEI, anti-equity, whatever you want to call it, it's all part of a censorship agenda. Those are the same groups that want to privatize public education, they're the same groups. Now, I think it's a multi-faceted answer, because that isn't to say that there aren't people that are more drawn to, for instance, a concern about what their kids reading in school. Or, you know, in some of there are people that are well-intentioned that start receiving this kind of misinformation, and you're just trying to figure out what's going on with your kid, which is where I think folks like you guys have a lot of power in helping with, in helping sort of correct that, and helping educate, and helping create community with people so that you can all support each other around that. And so I'm not going to say that everybody that's in this stuff sort of has had a history of fighting against public ed, because some of them really are getting swept up into what we're seeing from these groups. But the muscle behind them and the funding behind them are the same groups that have sought to undermine public and public education. And if we're going to do real talk, it goes beyond that. I mean, these are the folks that didn't like public education once public education became public education for everybody. And so it goes back to earlier civil rights fights that are unfortunately arising again when we're still trying to move forward on progress that we need to make. So, I mean, I think you got to be really vigilant, but what we know is the networks are the same and what's behind them. But there may be people in your community that they really are just like motivated around curricula or things because they're getting swept up in some of this. And that's where I think you guys can really help in creating relationships with people and having conversations.
100%. Yeah. And when I'm saying, what are these groups targeting? I'm speaking about like these kind of like well-funded extremist
Yeah,
groups.
they target, I mean, they're going to be the same ones. We have a case in Mississippi where Mississippi legislature took COVID funds and diverted them to private schools. We've got, vouchers are back in terms of sort of, how education and resources are being diverted. What's old is new again, which isn't great for those of us that are from communities where education's been a frontline issue for a long time. And so they are the same. And Meg's work and our public records work, our investigations work has shown that, as well as our experience with partners that do this work a lot.
Yeah, and I like your point about parents get swept up in this 100%. And we always say that when you're talking at a school board, don't like go after all the parents in the room who are on the other side, because a lot of people are just there because they're confused and they're getting fed misinformation. And, if you are being fed some of this stuff and you don't really have a great understanding, you might be a little scared too if you think this is happening in your school. So the best, approach, like you said, is to bring them into community and really have those conversations and sharing where are these sources actually coming from? What is it that you're actually being told? Very important. All right. Well, before we jump into Q&A, and I would love for you guys who are listening, if you do have questions that you want answered about any of this, please go ahead and drop them in the chat. Julie Collins is going to be kind of getting us questions together. But I would be remiss not to ask you, because of your expertise in the, it was the Fifth Circuit, correct, that just ruled well, I want you to explain the ruling so people have a better picture and understand what is up with mifepristone right now.
Well, I'll tell you, the headlines weren't as bad as they normally are. Sometimes the headlines are so sensationalized, it's hard to sort of figure out what's going on. But, and I'll tell you at the outset, for those of you that have heard me talk before, at Democracy Forward, we do represent the generic manufacturer of a medication called mifepristone, which is the abortion pill, is what it's otherwise known as. And so I do say, I'm not talking on behalf of that client, but I do want you to know that we have that client in case can understand the perspective we're coming from. But there are right-wing interests that have sought to brought a case in Amarillo, Texas, in my home state, to essentially remove the approval of mifepristone. For those of you who aren't familiar with mifepristone, it's not just used for pregnancy termination. Doctors use it for a range of reproductive health care uses. Now that's not on label. I mean, the on label use is early pregnancy termination, but and it's been approved by FDA for that purpose. But you can see public reporting around its use in miscarriage care or other things like that. So so it's essential reproductive health care medication. And this very right-wing judge that comes out of a movement judge that comes out of the far right sort of Christian nationalist movement issued an order in Texas that sought to suspend the approval for the medication. And it was an order that was really scary. We came on and talked about it before because a lot of communities were worried that the access to the medication was going to be taken off the market altogether. And to make a very long story short, the Supreme Court paused and said, sort of blocked any effect on the availability of the medication while the litigation continues to play out. And I think that's the main thing to remember is it doesn't matter what happened yesterday in the Fifth Circuit right now because of the Supreme Court. And because of the temporary the stay that it issued, while this is all playing out in the courts, the medication remains lawful and available, throughout the country, or available throughout the country, and then various state laws have purported to restrict it, which is something we're challenging separately. So yesterday, the Fifth Circuit issued a ruling that it did not sort of confirm all of what the district court did. But it did purport to roll back, at some other time, some of the labeling for the drug, which essentially means that the mifepristone could be less accessible, where it may not be available through the mail or things like that. That FDA has changed. Now there's going to be a long road ahead, so I'm sort of remiss to get into a bunch of details here because of that Supreme Court stay. The medication remains approved lawfully in accordance with its label. But there will be, and the government's already said that it will appeal what the Fifth Circuit did. There will be yet another case at the Supreme Court this term where this will probably arise back up there. Separately, and then we'll take, just for you guys to know, and you can follow this on our website, but separately in states like West Virginia, where the state has banned abortion post-Dobbs, we are representing the manufacturer of the pill to challenge those bans based on the fact that in the United States, the drugs that you can receive that are FDA approved don't and should not depend on your zip code, but that, when you have a nationally approved product, our, theory in the case for many very specific reasons, including the way Congress has regulated mifepristone specifically, is that states can't interfere there. And so that's an effort that we're engaging in to try to create paths for access in states where access has been severely restricted. It's not unrelated to the Texas work, but it's a separate effort. So we're engaged in that, and you can follow along on our website more of that. But the bottom line is yesterday's thing did not change anything about the availability of the medication, which is very good.
That's good, because it was very, very confusing, and I don't think it was covered very well in the media.
Very confusing, but at least I think yesterday at least the headlines weren't like some of the ones a few months ago were just like, this thing's coming off the market tomorrow. I mean, it was very confusing.
All right, I'm going to bring Julie up here, and Julie, if there are any questions in the chat that we need to go over.
There are several, actually. First one is, who's fighting back, and who will support good candidates? There's like two questions that ask the same kind of question. Supporting, mainstream, moderate, progressive candidates for school board. Do you know of a group out there that is doing that?
Groups like LEAD and Emerge do candidate training, and they're in different states. I know there's like a LEAD Ohio. We have one in Ohio here. Emerge is in some other states. They do candidate training across all different, not just school board, but they do candidate training. There are, and I'm sorry, off the top of my head, I'm not thinking of I know there are some because I've sent them to my own personal friend who's running for school board. There are women's groups who are out there supporting school board candidates. Not only with just like how to run for school board, what kind of messaging do you need? They're giving them financial support. Vote Mama is one. If you guys have any friends running for office, doesn't even have to be school board, who are women with, moms. I think they have to have kids like under 18. They are there to support women with young kids running for office. But yeah, I would say in the last 2 years, we really started sounding the alarm at Red, White, and Blue about school board issues and the importance of school board and how these attacks were coming. And it was funny because I felt like we were kind of the ones screaming. And then now all of a sudden there was like 1 million people getting involved and recognizing. So there is a ton of support right now for trying to get school board candidates out there. But,
there are a lot of even neighborhood groups that have kind of grown up organically. I know here in Ohio, we have those too, where they are very active and they're trying to keep these folks off of their school boards. So
honestly,
they're definitely out there.
Yeah, just like even your local grassroots groups, like my group here, we look for candidates now. Like we actively look for people to run for office where I live, and it's not a party. It's just literally a bunch of us who live in my city, and we are actively always looking for a good candidate. So.
So who's writing bills on the liberal side, on the side against these extreme folks that are trying to get things passed through legislatures? Is there anyone on the opposite side trying to, prevent them from doing that?
There are many groups, and I'll just start naming some. Education Law Center, PEN America, and some of the tracking groups that we mentioned earlier now have toolkits in some of their spaces. ACLU, some of their state chapters will have some of that legislation. I'm trying to think. AFT, some of the unions, the teachers' unions, or sort of teachers' organizations will have certain ones. So it is not that there are not sort of models out there, innovative models or otherwise models out there. The difference between sort of our movement, which is what I call the democracy side of history, and this far right movement is we actually care about people and communities. So when we're trying to do something, and you guys are trying to do something in your lives and in your work, you are trying to consider both the thing that you're trying to accomplish with whatever the bill is, but also the effect that it has on everybody. And it could be that there's only a certain amount of money available to the school, and you got to think about a lot of different factors, right? It's all this stuff. The far right is unconcerned about that, because they will take one ideological position and be able to just sort of ramrod it through without any concern about any other attendant effects on others. So I can be hard on sometimes our side of history, because I think we all need to be using our power in and encouraging others to use their power, because that will really be the thing that can turn the tide here. But I think it's also, we've got a much harder job ahead of us, because we actually care in many ways and can't just look at things through some just narrow lens on one issue. So, but there are lots of good organizations out there, and the state, you all know this, but the state legislative sessions usually in most states, not all states, will start sort of towards the beginning of the year, and usually a few months before that. So sort of later in the fall, you'll start seeing news coverage and information from organizations about more state-based things they're going to do, and that's a good time to get some real understanding of the types of policy proposals and things that might be out there.
And then someone had an interesting question. Their library sold them a book for 25 cents that turned out to be a banned book. So the question was, how do they find out if that is a coincidence or was it on purpose to get the book out of the library?
You were hearing that a lot, both in our work and then in some of our personal lives, that there are these book sales, and it's like there's always good book sales, but are they now being motivated by trying to just get books out that that are the subject of this, which is really scary. I don't know that there's necessarily a way, but I do think I do think you can ask questions. I mean, I don't think there's anything against, you can ask the library, how many of the books in your book sale, here's the list, how many of these books were in your book sale, to try to see if there are those coincidences. And you can also, again, tell your report. I mean, I think you can ask, you can get others to ask. And then I don't know that we're aware yet, Meg, are we? I don't think we're aware yet of an actual encouragement that these groups are doing to say, go sell these books. I don't think we've seen that, but we've certainly been hearing this now, that a lot of book sales are happening with these titles.
I think you're spot on that, on that, Sky. And we've been really active in Arkansas and had the opportunity to represent some librarians, and unfortunately in some states, I think the leaders in those states are viewing librarians as not the same, community leaders, neighbors, and allies that others that we all think of our librarians are. Or I often think of our librarians are. So unfortunately, I think there's been an increasing number of attacks and threats on librarians.
Book Riot, which is Kelly Jensen. She's actually did a FOIA training for us, but it's been a while. But I just Googled on her site, and she has an article about how to use FOIA requests, which is Freedom of Information Act. So there's the link if you want to check out Book Riot. That's a good resource.
I also dropped in the chat, in case it's helpful for anyone, the page on our website that talks about the book bans that we've been seeing and we're investigating in Central New York and Pennsylvania. If you scroll at the bottom of that page, we've posted some of the records requests that we submitted in Pennsylvania. Again, like the model request is going to differ depending on where you're at, and some toolkits that have been posted will address that. And it'll give you a sense if you're interested in seeing what kinds of things you may be able to ask for.
Megan,
so for example, you may not be able to find out like all the things that an organization like Independence Law Center is talking about or is contracted to work with the school board on, but if you get a contract, then that those, that gives you confirmation that there is a relationship that exists.
I'm sorry, Megan, I just brought you up because you're talking enough that you should be up here. So I was like, I should bring her up. Julia, other questions?
So the last one, several people ask in a couple of different ways, why are these folks doing this? Now, some answers that were given was to privatize school and to bust the teachers unions. But I also think, this is my personal opinion, that they're trying to eliminate and destroy public school altogether. What do you guys think about that?
They're definitely part of a movement to undermine public schools, which goes back to, very concerning movements to resist equity, to resist equalized education in this country. The other thing I'll say is there's also at the same time, and those folks have always existed and they're sort of having a moment now. There's also at this time in the country just a broader anti-democratic movement for whatever reason, right? Where people, it's very minority of folks, but they're very loud. And they're really seeking to move the country back, not just on sort of more innovative places we should have probably been trying to go in the country, but also sort of rolling back our rights. I mean, we've seen that whether it's affirmative action, whether it's abortion, whether it's a number of things, workers' rights. We're seeing that. And this type of go into communities, try to, make people scared and sow a culture war has always been, it's always been a core tactic of these movements. And so the other thing I would just say is I think there's like the normal destroy public education crowd, which sort of overlaps to some degree at times with this real anti-democratic actor crowd, but there's a Venn diagram, and there's another thing at play here in some of these communities that's really the far right will take any issue that it can to try to keep people distracted from from really what they're trying to do, which is to undermine the foundations of our country in many ways. And so that's my explanation. I think it's kind of a both and. I think some of it arises out of the education front, and I think some of it arises out of this broader political movement at the time. Some people get manipulated into it. So it's not to say sometimes you have to get angry and sometimes you have to really sort of hold everybody that's participating in it accountable. But I think there probably are in some communities opportunities to bring some people along that really are trying to make sense out of it. And if you're in a community where that side just has been louder.
All right. Well, we thank you always, Megan. Thank you for joining us up here and participating. Thank you both for being here. Always a pleasure to have you, Sky. I'm sure wheels already spinning on what we'll have you come back to talk about next. So
yeah, well, we've in the fall, I mean, there's all the work that you guys are doing across so many issues that we work on too, which is really fun. And then we're always happy to talk to you about, what's happening at the Supreme Court or how that relates to your communities, not just sort of what's happening there. There'll be a lot going on.
Appreciate all you guys do, really trying to stand up for democracy and represent us and help people who, it can be a lot with legal stuff. So it's nice to have somebody doing that for just because you're there to help. I really appreciate that. So
We,
um,
we love you guys, and y'all are on the front lines of this in the communities. And so whatever tools we can provide to help, we're always grateful to do so.
awesome. All right. Well, everybody, thank you for coming this evening and hanging out with us, and I hope you all have a really good rest of your evening.